Hi team. Separation is not inherent to reality. Separation is added by the mind. It is the activity of the mind that creates the division and apparent seeming separateness of all things. But this division and separateness is not an inherent property of the universe itself. It's not as though there are a near infinite number of objects, entities, beings, phenomena that is almost but not quite uncountable. That is simply how the mind habitually attempts to understand its experience. The reality is there are no separate things. There are no separate objects. All is one unified whole, a singular being. To realize and experience fully this oneness is not a cognitive analytical process by which one eventually arrives at the feeling of wholeness or oneness, but rather a ceasing of the mind activity that is creating the separation in the first place. Simple, yes. Easy, we shall see. Come to understand the mind as a verb rather than a noun. Mind is an activity. It is an action to mind. Mind is not a separate solid object in itself. So this initial understanding of mind as activity, not mind as object, is a very powerful first step into realizing the wholeness of being. Because to think of mind as an object, as a thing, a solid entity, then sets up and creates the task of trying to get rid of a thing. And it's impossible to get rid of a thing that isn't there. Be like trying to there was a hologram of a person, you try and push that hologram out of the room? How's that going to go? Is that going to work? You can't get rid of something that isn't there in the first place. Getting into a fist fight with a ghost. And yet, that is what many seekers on the spiritual path are doing. Inadvertently. There's no judgment. That's a very common and logical trap to fall into. And it happens due to our habitual way of perceiving reality. Cognition, thinking, and the mind is the world of objects. And so the mind understands itself as that which it perceives all other things. It sees and divides everything up into separate, near infinite separateness of many differing objects, and regards itself to be one of those things. That is why the mind comes to believe itself to be a thing. But if we release that belief, just drop that belief, quite easy to do, it's staggeringly easy, right? This is why it's sudden awakening in Zen and many other traditions. It's just, it was that easy all along to just drop that belief. Yeah, right. There's nothing separate. It never was, never has been. It's I done divided up the universe again, didn't I? Does happen. Never mind. Cheers. And you can stop doing it just as easily as you started doing it. So understanding the mind as an activity rather than an object makes the task much clearer, much simpler. We're not trying to push a hologram out of the room because the hologram doesn't exist. Instead, we are ceasing an activity. We are letting go of an activity. To use that same metaphor, we are turning off the hologram projector. Not interested in the actual hologram itself. Why don't instead, if this holographic person is causing us so much distress, which, the mind-identified ego could be said to be a holographic person causing much distress. Right? If the hologram of a person is causing us distress, we're not interested in trying to fight the hologram, trying to change the hologram. Let's find the projector. Let's find what is projecting, creating this illusion. Just switch it off. No more hologram. We could say that this hologram is the activity of the projector. There is no solid thing there. But if we were to observe the hologram, it appears as though there is something there. Even the way I'm speaking now, the language that we have to kind of communicate with, because that's the one we've got, separates and divides everything up. So when I speak of a hologram, it is as though I am speaking about a real, solid, tangible object, phenomena. But actually, there's no such thing. What I am speaking of is the activity of a holographic projector that is projecting light in such a way that it creates an illusion. And this is exactly what the activity of mind does when it creates a model of the universe and then is baffled by its own projection. The mind creates this image, this idea of a universe that is near infinite in size, and then cannot comprehend just how vast and huge it is. The universe is not big because there is no size. There is no distance. There's no such thing. The mind creates it. Size and distance is not something that is inherent to reality. Size and distance is something the mind does. In order to categorize, divide, and understand its own experience, it creates the rules of its own game, and then doesn't like the rules of its own game. Doesn't understand the rules of its own game. To understand this is to recognize, let's take the example, let's take a tree. And we can measure the height of the tree and say it's so many meters high. But meters is not an inherent property to the tree. If no people ever perceived a particular tree, which obviously happens all the time deep in rainforests, there's areas people have never been, could we say those trees don't have that label of height on them? By which I mean height is not an inherent property of the tree. It doesn't exist in reality. Mind creates the concept of height and then attaches it to the tree. And the same could be said for weight. We could cut the tree down and weigh it. It's this many kilos. But weight, in exactly the same way, is not a property of the tree. All of these numbers, they are illusions, fabrications. They might be useful to some extent, but we have come to believe that our units of measurement are somehow an inherent, real, tangible thing, and they're not. So the mind, in its habitual activity, is dividing everything up that we see. But understand that upon ceasing this activity, you recognize that nothing is separate. And here's the bit that'll really bake your noodle. All right? Is that the mind has come to habitually separate your individual body from the rest of the universe. You feel that you are somehow here by accident, or it's some kind of mistake. this can't be right. Or perhaps some other model to explain why am I here? This is all created by the mind. The reality, the realization, oh, I was never separate in the first place. You are made out of the universe. And you always have been. And you always will be. So upon ceasing this mind activity, recognizing, hang on, what's with all those names and numbers and ideas and opinions and beliefs that I place upon my individual body and mind? You think you're so and so years old, you think you weigh a certain amount, you think you have a certain amount of money. But all of those things are not inherent to reality itself. All of those things are concepts, ideas, words, and that's all. Now, we can still, if we choose to, continue with that activity. There's no inherent harm in any of that. There's not even any inherent harm in money itself. It's not actually a problem in itself. All of these things may be useful concepts. But we so often and so habitually fall into the trap of sinking into this belief that our concepts are actual reality. And they're not. This is especially true of our concept of time. There is no such thing as time. The universe is not made out of time. Time only exists when you begin counting. What if you just let go of this? Not 1 second ever passed. Not one, ever. There has never been 1 second. Why? Because there's no such thing as a second, other than as an activity of the mind that it uses to count, so that it can somehow organize its own experience into something. Well, that's okay. That's another hologram. But let's turn the projector off and realize, oh, there was never any time. And upon that recognition, which anyone can come to that understanding, it happens all the time, quite profoundly as well, really abide in the implications of that. You are 0 years old. It's not the current year. It's not the current time. Those things are just illusions. Now, if there's no time, That means eternity is happening now, and always has been, and always will be. This is eternity now. As you listen to these words, you are currently experiencing eternity. This is true in your experience right now. This is eternity, because eternity is not a big measurement of time. So because eternity is not a measurement of time, because it never began and it will never end, it's not a very, very long time, which is how the mind wants to think of eternity and infinity. The mind wants to think of it like, whoa, that vast, incomprehensible amount of time. Eternity is not an amount of time. It's happening now. And because it happens now, and always will, and your experience is now, you are experiencing eternity. And this did not begin at a certain point, and it will not end at a certain point. This is one of the ways that the mind categorizes and divides yourself from the universe. You hear it often, people talking about, oh, yeah, no, humanity just exists as a split second of time, and the universe is so vast and we're insignificant. This is quite a nasty trick of the mind. You are not insignificant, and you do not exist as a single blip of half a second of time. That is simply not the case. You are eternal and everywhere. So upon the releasing and the ceasing of mind activity, one recognizes the non-separation. Now, Advaita, which is the principles and practice that I most often speak on when I speak on spiritual matters on this channel, is often translated to mean non-duality or not two. That tends to be the English word that we use when we speak of Advaita. But dare I suggest a different translation and say non-separation. This can provide a powerful shift in your understanding. Non-duality, meaning not two, is powerful because it means it's not as though it's you and the outside world. So there's not two things. It's just one thing. We can't even say there's one thing because one implies another, right? This will really bake your noodle, all right? Because to say everything is one is also slightly misleading. It's a more refined understanding. It's a more powerful, auspicious understanding, but even that's not quite accurate. It would be more accurate to say all is zero. There was never anything here in the first place. No birth, no change, no death. Advaita. So if we were to say non-separation, That is one way to cease the activity of the mind. But we must abide within the implications of that. To start doing this, just soften these hard lines of separation that we commonly create, these barriers, these hard categories and lines. And the most common one, and one we do most habitually, so much so that we don't even realize we're doing it, is to create a distinction between the outside and the inside world. There's no such thing. There's no difference between the outside and inside world. That distinction was created by the mind. That distinction is not inherent to your experience. It's something you assumed along the way, partly because you're told, and partly because this is just a I don't want to say natural belief. It's a rational belief, a rational assumption to arrive at. But reality itself never divided an outside or inside world. If you have an empty jam jar, why a jam jar, I don't know, but if you have an empty jam jar, is the space outside of the jar different to the space inside of the jar? And the mind will say, it depends if the lid is on. Forget the lid, right? Just don't worry about that. Why is the space outside the jar different to the space inside the jar? And so too, when we come to recognize our own experience, why is the outside world separate to our inside world? What creates that separation? I mean, it seems obvious. It's obvious there's an outside and inside world. It appears so obvious, but that's only because our assumption has been going on for so long. Just drop that assumption and go back to basics. We're talking going back to when you were 4 years old. Not that there's such a thing as years, but we're talking the first. If you think of an infant, it takes them quite a while to begin to process things in terms of separate objects. It takes a while for that to happen. There's a long period in which the infant isn't seeing separation. So there's proof that separation is not inherent to being, because an infant is a being, right? Cute little thing. Right? An infant is a being. I'm not more being than an infant. An adult is not more of a being than an infant. An adult is not superior to an infant. That's something the mind decides due to its categorization, its judgment, its labeling. An infant is a being just like any other, and yet the infant doesn't see separation. Everything is just one. Homogeneous, beautiful whole. But at some point, we began to divide and separate everything into objects, and at some point created a distinction between outside and inside world. But let's rewind the non-existent holographic clock, because that's the noise that holographic non-existent clocks make. Cheers. Yummy. I've got a bit of a sore throat today, you can probably hear it. This is just standard coffee. Ugh. I don't have milk or sugar in there. I have it neat. The cheaper the instant coffee, the better as well. It's like engine oil. It'll really clear you out. We're going to run that non-existent clock all the way back to recognize at which point did we assume the outside and inside world were separate. And just softening the edges here, just soften the edges of your experience. And let's go deeply away from the mind. Forget the mind, forget the activity of the mind. Forget the naming, the labeling, all that malarkey, right? All that jazz. Had enough of that. Lord knows we've had enough of that, right? Does the world need more thinking? Really? Do we really need more thought, opinions? Do we need more words? Do we need more people expressing thoughts and opinions? Do we really need that? Or would it be better if we had less of that? That with world peace, right? Isn't that the goal? World peace. And peace is achieved through a cessation of chaos. Peace is not a state to achieve. Peace is the natural state of being. Nature is always at peace. If we ceased the chaos of the mind, we would be at peace. World peace right there. Let's save the world, team. Let's save the world. Let's do it. By releasing the activity of the mind. Don't worry about mind. And go instead to the awareness of your experience now. Now. Just this moment now. And be aware of your experience. Now understand that you are aware of all of your experience equally. Whether it's the sensation in your hand if you do this, the sight, the things that you can see, what you can hear, touch, smell, taste, the sensations of the body, the activity of the mind and your emotions and all the stories, everything, all of it, right? The one unifying aspect of all of that is that you are aware of that experience. Now the mind divides all of that experience into those separate categories that I just mentioned. But it's the mind that creates that distinction. So the sensation in the hand, everything you can see, touch, smell, taste, sensations in the body, thoughts and emotions, and the whole story, the whole narrative. It is the mind that creates the distinction between all of those things. But the distinction, the separation between all of those things is not inherent to the experience itself. So, if we are not separating our experience into separate solid categories and simply experiencing the current experience with pure awareness without any mind activity added, there is the deepest, most powerful sense of relief and peace that it's possible to feel as a human. No longer dividing, no longer analyzing, no longer burdened with the responsibility of trying to understand and analyze every single thing that wanders into the field of experience. Forget all of that. Just be, as the awareness itself, aware of an experience. All is well. All is well. It is the mind that tasked itself with fixing the universe. When did we decide that? The universe doesn't need any help. Maybe you are more religious or you follow a different spiritual tradition. They're all good. They're all perfect, actually, because they all lead to the same place, the top of the mountain, peace. But ask yourself then, God doesn't need your help. It would be pretty arrogant and, dare I say, blasphemous to start thinking that you know better than God. How can you? When did you decide you're the one who has to sort all of this out? You're in good hands, right? You're in good hands. Just leave it all alone. Trust. Have faith. The mind is what created all the troubles on earth. Isn't that a head scratcher? The mind is what created all of the problems. Without mind, there would be no problems. That is what is meant by eating of the tree of knowledge. That was our first mistake, our original sin. Eating of the tree of knowledge. That's the one action that done goofed up the whole thing, the whole shebang. Everything was fine before that. The Garden of Eden, we could say, in that infant state or even pre-birth state, you weren't suffering. You didn't have any problems at all. It was peace. When did the problems begin? The problems began when you started to create separation, creating that separation through the habitual mind activity of dividing, division. Upon eating the tree of knowledge, upon eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which we could say is beginning mind activity, that is when you are cast out of peace. You are cast out of paradise. Why? Because you have separated yourself from God. A different way of saying that would be that by engaging the cognition, if we want to speak scientifically, why not? The scientific method is just another spiritual practice after all. If we engage the neocortex, we create our own suffering by placing ourselves as separate from the universe. And through that neocortex activity separating ourselves, we then feel vulnerable, frantic, overburdened with responsibility. We feel terrified and horrified all of the time. So now that we know, spit that fruit back out. Blah. Oh, whoops. Should not have tasted of that. Should not have done it. Adam and Eve got a lot to answer for, right? Honestly. And then they started pointing fingers at each other. No, it was her fault. No, it was his fault. It was the snake's fault, really. I mean, dang. Flipping snake. As a side note, it's always very convenient to have something to blame, isn't it? There was no snake. That was the They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing man that he does not exist. But I'm going to go one further. I think the greatest trick that man ever pulled was convincing God that the devil exists. You know, someone to pin it all on. It wasn't me. It's a snake. I'm surprised God didn't hang it. Oh, really? Was it? Snakes can't talk, though, can they? I've made a talking snake. But because God is all loving and ever accepting, he probably just with a knowing smile went, okay, Adam, sure. Okay, Eve. I see. Must have been that snake. We'll sort that out. We'll patch that out in the next universe. We'll fix that bug. Wasn't there in the first place. You are the snake. Because the mind is what's creating all of these issues and problems in the first place. So, to collapse this distinction between outside and inside, as we just did that experiment of the sensations in the hand, thoughts, feelings, emotions, even the narrative, all of the senses, everything, right? Just bring it into a singular experience and find that there's no edges to this. Where does it end? Do you end at your skin? Do you end at the edge of the sphere of what your senses can receive? Because all of those things exist as a passing temporary phenomena within the field of experience. Now, the mind, having had its noodle thoroughly baked, then starts going, yeah, but there is a space outside of that sphere in which I can't experience directly the sensations in that area. So I can see, I can look out now and see birds, but if I'm consciousness that's everywhere, how can I experience? Surely if I was infinite universal consciousness, I'd be experiencing what it's like to be a bird at the same time as this, right? A very logical, rational line of inquiry, definitely one to resolve. So if we come to understand, actually, the infinite universal consciousness, I can see a bird over there, right? It's a pigeon that stood on a chimney. Quite a nice looking pigeon. What? It's quite a healthy pigeon, right? I could say in that space, in that area, the universe is currently having a pigeon experience. Just as in this area around here, the universe is having the Corin Bryant experience. It's having a human experience here. But in order to have the human experience cannot include the pigeon experience. Because the moment that happens, I'm ceasing to have the human experience in this temporary, finite appearance. The habit of the mind is to ascribe its own limitations upon the infinite universal consciousness. But the individual human experience is not the same as infinite universal consciousness. This is where words begin to break down a little, but I'm doing my best to explain this. This will just have to happen to arise naturally. Because ultimately, The infinite universal consciousness is just pure awareness always and everywhere. And it is currently aware of the Corin Bryant human experience, absolutely. But the universe itself is not actually the Corin Bryant experience. The universe is not the human being experience, and it's not the pigeon experience. The infinite universal consciousness is infinite universal consciousness. That's it. Now, all of these things arise within it, within you. You just so happen to be having that one that you're currently having right now. But just as all thoughts and feelings are temporary, that rise and fall, where are yesterday's thoughts, for example? They've risen and fallen, and yet you were aware of them, and yet your awareness remains here still, your consciousness is still here, but all of yesterday's thoughts have completely vanished. Where did they go? So were those thoughts you? So at exactly the same, with exactly the same understanding, we understand that, well, the individual human will rise and fall, will come and go. The mind activity of that individual will stay a while in the field of awareness, will stay a while in the field of consciousness, and then will vanish at some point. But the awareness itself won't vanish. It's about as simply as I can put it. If I was to speak any more on it, it would just be muddying the waters. Just go back and listen to that again a couple of times, and that's as powerfully and as simply as it can be put. In order to do that, we have to let go. Let go of our attachment and our clinging to this one singular individual. It is freedom from the person, not freedom for the person. To remove the distinction between the outside and inside is the same as taking that lid off of the jam jar to allow the space inside and outside to join. That might be a satisfying way for the mind to orient itself in this understanding. Take the lid off. How do you take the lid off? By chopping your head off. Not literally. Don't do that. Figuratively. Just drop that. Drop that. And rejoin the infinite ground of being. Go back to the Garden of Eden. Return to God. You will be welcomed with open arms. As though this whole chaos of the mind had never happened, you will be washed clean of all of this. Never happened. You simply temporarily entered a nightmarish, dreamlike state that was the terror and horror of separation. Abide in non-separation, and the universe will trouble you no longer. That is everything I have for you today, team. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on the way out. And channel memberships are available somewhere along the bottom here if you want access to my exclusive guided meditations and talks. There's also a Discord chat room where we can discuss all of these matters and join the community of like-minded individuals who are committed to awakening, finding inner peace, and healing from this horrifying nightmare of separation. Take care, be well, and stay present.